Let's look at a theory that many people believe. It's one that I also believed too, until I looked into it for myself. The theory comes from a book written in 1976 called The 13th Tribe by a man named Arthur Koestler. In the book he claims that the Ashkenazi Jews, these are the Jews that had gathered in Europe around the Middle Ages, were descended from an area in the east called Khazaria. He claimed that the Khazars were a white race of people and that their royalty converted to Judaism for political reasons around the year 800, even though they were not ethnic Jews. And then they forced the population to convert as well. Then they claimed that these people migrated to Europe and became what we now call Ashkenazi Jews. Therefore, they say that the Ashkenazi Jews, which constitute the majority of modern-day Jews, are not Jewish at all and have no claim to the land of Israel today. I have found that this theory is not correct at all, and there's plenty of evidence that proves it isn't. One clue should be that the people today keep pointing back to this book written in the 70s to support this claim, instead of pointing to recent papers or historians or archaeologists that prove it. That's because modern historians and archaeologists, even with Arab sympathies, don't buy Koestler's theory. One example is a scholar named Bernard Lewis. He's a man who the Encyclopedia of Historians and Historical Writing calls the, quote, most influential post-war historian of Islam and the Middle East. He's also a person with a long history of defending the religion of Islam. He said this about Koestler's book, The 13th Tribe, quote, this theory is supported by no evidence whatsoever. It has long since been abandoned by all the serious scholars in the field, including those in Arab countries, where the Khazar theory is little used except in occasional political polemics. Another man, Douglas Morton Dunlop, who is cited as, quote, the most esteemed scholar of the Khazar monarchy, end quote, said that the theory that Eastern European Jews were the descendants of the Khazars can, quote, be dealt with very shortly because there is little evidence which bears directly upon it, and it unavoidably retains the character of a mere assumption, end quote. Let me show you some terrific reasons why this theory is wrong, but before I do, it's important to define a few terms, as many of the presentations that try to convince people of this idea seem to be confused on some pretty basic issues. First, there are two main types of Jewish ethnic divisions in the world. They are the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim. The word Ashkenaz means German, and the word Sephrad means Spain. These are the two largest groups. During the 1,000 years of the diaspora, or the dispersion of the Jews from the Middle East, many Jewish communities were established by Jewish settlers in various places around the world, often at great distances from one another, resulting in long-term isolation from each other. These communities would develop under the influence of their local environments. Two main centers of Jewish populations were in modern-day Germany and Spain. Sephardim are Jewish people that settled in and around Spain, although the name now also includes other Jewish ethnic groups that simply worship in the same style that they do. Although the spread of Jews into Spain is most commonly associated with the diaspora, which began after the Roman conquest of Judea in 70 AD, immigration from Judea into the area can be dated before the destruction of Jerusalem. And really, no matter which dates you prefer for the Sephardim settling in Spain, this group settled in Europe long before the Khazar Empire ever existed. Germany was also an area that over time many Jewish people settled in. It became one of the few places in the world that Jewish culture thrived. They established universities and businesses. The term Ashkenazi, although meaning German, later came to refer to a wider region of Eastern European Jews. So what do we know about the Khazars? It's likely that the Khazar nation was made up of tribes from various ethnic backgrounds, as steppe nations traditionally absorbed those that they conquered. Their name is accordingly derived from the Turkic Khaz, meaning to wander or flee, but we don't know much about them for sure. It is known that there was, as the book The 13th Tribe suggests, a conversion of the royal family to Judaism around the year 800. This fact is attested to in various historical sources, although for many years the only people to claim this was the Jews themselves. In the Jewish Encyclopedia it states, quote, the conversion of the leading Khazars to Judaism perhaps took place toward 740 CE. Ironically, for many years it was only the Jews who claimed that this was true, and it wasn't until recently that modern archaeology has proven what the Jewish historians have been saying the whole time. I've heard many people mention this encyclopedia issue, as if it somehow confirms that Ashkenaz was founded by the Khazars. But it doesn't at all. It simply states that there was a conversion of the Khazar royal family to Judaism. The amount of people in the country that converted to Judaism with the royals is debated somewhat. Some say it was just the royals and most of the upper nobility. Others say it was the entire country that converted. This seems unlikely because of all the historical accounts of that area being a melting pot of Muslims and Christians as well as Jews after this fact. It really doesn't matter, actually. The question in regard to this theory is, did these people migrate to Europe en masse to become what is known as the Ashkenazi Jews, as Koestler says that they did? There are many ways, actually, to test this theory, so let's take a look at some of them. The first thing that we need to get out of the way is this issue of race versus parentage. Many of the websites and videos that I've watched which attempt to convince people of this theory say simply that the Jews are supposed to be brown, and the Khazars were white, and Ashkenazi Jews are also white, and therefore the case is closed. Now, there's a ton of problems with this idea. And setting aside the idea that these people claim that the Khazars were white, which nobody knows for sure, but Asian characteristics do seem to be the most likely hypothesis. But nevertheless, let me demonstrate how common parentage and race are different. One writer said it this way: let me illustrate this point. If I were to marry an Asian woman and father children who then married other Asians, these children would be my descendants. If that woman were to die, and I were to marry an African woman and have children, and they were to marry others of African descent, they would also be my descendants. One set of my descendants would be racially Asian, and the other racially African, but they would both be my descendants. Today's Jewish people claim to be, by and large, the community of physical descendants of Abraham and the patriarchs. Whatever their race, race is not the issue. The issue is descent. The fact is that you can't tell who is and who isn't a Jew based on skin color. But thanks to modern technology, we now do have a way to test this. And it will be the first way we will look at to debunk the idea of the 13th tribe. Over the last 10 years, there's been astonishing discoveries in the area of genetic testing that not only destroy any hope of this 13th tribe theory, but also offer dramatic proof to the biblical account of history as well. Genetic testing of both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim, and even Samaritan Jews, which are the ones that have never left the land of Israel, reveal a common ancestor. And what's even more amazing is that that ancestor traces back to the same area in the Middle East, and to the same time in history. There are some finer details about this testing which we're going to look at in a minute, but I think the most amazing part of this genetic research is in regard to something called the Kohanim. The Kohanim, or people with the last name Cohen, is basically a person that claims to be descended from the biblical person Aaron, who was Moses' brother. They were the priests, and people today that have the last name Cohen are essentially claiming that they are descended from this man 3,000 years ago. And what makes them such good test subjects for this genetic research is that while Jews in general mostly married within their tribes over the years, the Kohanim were ultra particular about this, and even today there are strict rules about marriage for people of the Cohen line. Another important factor in this is in regard to the nature of the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is one of two chromosomes that determine the sex of a child, and it is passed from father to son. So, if I had a son, he would inherit a Y chromosome from me and an X chromosome from his mother. And if I had a daughter, she would inherit an X chromosome from me and an X chromosome from her mother. Since Y chromosomes are passed from father to son, all Kohanim men should theoretically have almost identical Y chromosomes. This can be tested with the genealogical DNA test. And in addition, as the rate that mutations accumulate on the Y chromosome is relatively constant, scientists can also estimate the elapsed time since two men had a common ancestor. So they can know the time period when this original man existed. And amazingly, because of the so-called halotype, they can also tell more or less what region in the world this man lived in. Isn't science cool? The Cohen hypothesis was first tested in 1997. In their study, which was published in the journal Nature, they found that genetic similarities appeared to be shared by both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Cohens, pointing to a common Cohen population origin before the Jewish diaspora under the Roman Empire. many more studies were done with a greater number of test subjects and in many diverse areas in the years that followed that confirmed these initial findings. One recent study, published in 2009, demonstrates that 46.1% of Kohanim carry Y chromosomes belonging to a single parental lineage that likely originated in the Near East well before the dispersal of Jewish groups in the diaspora. Support for a Near Eastern origin of this lineage comes from its high frequency in the sampled Bedouins, Yemens, 67%, and Jordanians, 55%, and its precipitous drop in frequency as one moves away from Saudi Arabia and the Near East. Moreover, there is a striking contrast between the relatively high frequency of this gene in Jewish populations and its vanishingly low frequency in the sample of non-Jewish populations that hosted Jewish diaspora communities outside of the Near East. So a Jew may look like its host population, but it is genetically very distinct. I think it's really provocative that they also found this connection with the Kohens that have lived in Israel continuously this whole time, called the Samaritans. They are a very small group of people that broke away from traditional Judaism around the 5th century BC. And they have their own version of Judaism, but interestingly, they claim that their priests descend from the Cohen line as well. And in a 2004 article on genetic ancestry of the Samaritans, it concluded from a sample comparing Samaritans to several Jewish populations, all currently living in Israel, representing Ethiopian Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Iraqi Jews, Libyan Jews, Moroccan Jews, and Yemenite Jews, as well as Druze and non-Druze Palestinian Arabs, that the principal component analysis suggested a common ancestry of the Samaritans and Jewish patrilineages. Most of the former may be traced back to a common ancestor in what is today identified as the paternally inherited Israelite high priesthood, or the Kohanim, with a common ancestor projected to the time of the Assyrian conquest of the Kingdom of Israel. If you think about it, this is such a major blow, not only to the 13th tribe theory, but also to people that claim that Jews don't at least have a claim to the land of Israel, as well as people that claim that the Bible is not historically accurate. There's not a whole lot of people trying to disprove the core findings of this research. Now, there was a paper out about 10 years ago after the first tests were done by a guy named Zussman, who questioned that some of the evidence was being overstated. But those concerns were addressed in the subsequent studies, and even serious critics of Jews are coming to terms with this data. For instance, a man named David Duke, who was a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, who in his book My Awakening says that he believes in the Khazar theory, now seems to agree that, quote, genes don't lie. Unfortunately, he seems to be using this new information for negative ends too. Here's a clip from YouTube.
Jews from the different regions of the world were found to share many genetic traits that are distinct from other groups and that date back to ancient times. Now, much Jewish research exists on this subject. Researchers Kobylyansky and Lifshitz examined 25 morphological characteristics and estimated that Jews in Russia were 6 times more genetically distant from Russians than Russians were from Germans. I would never have guessed that Jews were 6 times more distant from Russians and other Europeans than, say, Russians are different from Germans or Frenchmen, or that Italians might be different from Swedes. But genes don't lie. Jewish differences exist whether or not one has the Jewish look. In fact, Jewish genetic difference is far greater under the skin than on the surface.
The point is that the Ashkenazi population, by and large, has the same Jewish genes as the Jewish populations all over the world. And this is the death nail to the theory that the Ashkenazi Jews descended from the Khazars. The entire premise of this theory has been totally shattered. That doesn't mean, however, that the Khazars played absolutely no role in the Ashkenazi community development. As with most lies, they often contain an element of truth. The genetic tests in the Ashkenazi population did show that there was a possible connection to Khazaria or some other genetic influence in a certain percentage of those tested, some say about 12%. This suggests that there was at least some amount of migration of refugees to Europe by Khazarians after the Khazar Empire was taken over, which was to be expected, as it was where most Jews, converts or not, gathered, as it was a major center of Jewish civilization at the time. But these refugees would have been very small, as historians note that the Khazar sovereignty was broken up by Sviatoslav I of Kiev. The Khazars became a subject people of the Kievian Ruses, gradually displaced by the Rus, the Kipchaks, and later the conquering Mongol Golden Horde. The Khazars largely disappeared as a culturally distinct people. But, as we have demonstrated, it doesn't matter anyway. There's no possible way, based on the genetic evidence, that Ashkenazi Jews originated from the Khazars. The Ashkenazi Jews are linked to Jews all over the world by their genes, even though they have different races. Another way to show that this theory is wrong is with language and culture, which, as social sciences, can be very helpful. Yiddish was the language spoken by early Ashkenazi Jews, and it's by tracing the migration of Yiddish that we can also trace the migration of the Ashkenazi Jews after they left the region. Yiddish is a Germanic language with a heavy influence of Hebrew. It also has traces of Latin-derived languages in it. Basically, it's a mix between Hebrew and European languages, and primarily German. And it uses the Hebrew alphabet. It's very similar to that of the Sephardim in Spain and Portugal, who spoke something called Ladino, which is basically a combination of Hebrew and the Latin languages of that region, and it too uses the Hebrew alphabet. The problem is that if the Ashkenazi Jews were descended from the Turks of Khazaria, the Khazars left no evidence of this in the language, which would be completely unheard of in historical linguistics, and it's very hard to believe. Yiddish bears no resemblance to the language of the Turks, and there's no shared vocabulary. This is a pretty big point if you're a linguist. But add to this the absence of any apparent cultural influence, and it's a dramatic leap of faith that the Ashkenazi Jews were descended from a country that has no evidence of it in their language or culture. One might even go so far as to say that such an idea is an impossibility. Another point is made by a commentator saying, those who continue to push forth the theory that Ashkenazi Jews are not real Jews also display a gross ignorance of the Jewish religion concerning the treatment and acceptance of converts. This is either ignored or unknown by those who make the accusation. Although we've already seen the DNA evidence that vindicates modern Jews, even if by some chance they were not ancestrally related, the fact remains, in Judaism, a convert is treated with the utmost respect and, according to Jewish law, no differentiation is made between a biological, if you will, Jew and a Jewish convert. Even some famous biblical characters, one example being Ruth, an ancestor of King David, were converts to the faith and not born into it as a descendant of Abraham. I, Chris, would even submit that the genealogy in the book of Matthew shows us that Jesus, or Yeshua, was legally descended from this line of Ruth through David all the way to his stepfather Joseph. But his blood connection to this line comes through his mother, which we find in the genealogy of Luke, which instead of going through the Solomon line, it goes through David's other son Nathan, which masterfully avoids a curse that was put on the line of Jeconiah. Today's Jewish people are by and large the community of physical descendants of a guy named Abraham. Whatever their race, race is not the issue. The issue is descent. Black Ethiopian Jews, blonde Jews from Scandinavia, Jews from India, they're all racially different, but all Jewish. Sure, there's been intermarriage, rape, conversion of Gentiles. Some non-Jews have entered into ethnic Jewry. But at the core, the Jewish community remains descended from patriarchal Israel. Thanks for your time. Two main types of Jewish ethnic divisions in the world. They are the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim. The word Ashkenaz means German, and the word Sephrad means Spain. These are the two largest groups. During the 1,000 years of the diaspora, or the dispersion of the Jews from the Middle East, many Jewish communities were established by Jewish settlers in various places around the world, often at great distances from one another, resulting in long-term isolation from each other. These communities would develop under the influence of their local environments. Two main centers of Jewish... Let's look at a theory that many people believe. It's one that I also believe too, until I looked into it for myself. The theory comes from a book written in 1976 called The 13th Tribe by a man named Arthur Koestler. In the book he claims that the Ashkenazi Jews, these are the Jews that had gathered in Europe around the Middle Ages, were descended from an area in the east called Khazaria. He claimed that the Khazars were a white race of people and that their royalty converted to Judaism for political reasons around the year 800, even though they were not ethnic Jews. And then they forced the population to convert as well. Then they claimed that these people migrated to Europe and became what we now call Ashkenazi Jews. Therefore, they say that the Ashkenazi Jews, which constitute the majority of modern-day Jews, are not Jewish at all and have no claim to the land of Israel today. I have found that this theory is not correct at all, and there's plenty of evidence that proves it isn't. One clue should be that the people today keep pointing back to this book written in the 70s to support this claim, instead of pointing to recent papers or historians or archaeologists that prove it. That's because modern historians and archaeologists, even with Arab sympathies, Douglas Morton Dunlop, who is cited as, quote, the most esteemed scholar of the Khazar monarchy, end quote, said that the theory that Eastern European Jews were the descendants of the Khazars can, quote, be dealt with very shortly because there is little evidence which bears directly upon it, and it unavoidably retains the character of a mere assumption, end quote. Let me show you some terrific reasons why this theory is wrong, but before I do, it's important to define a few terms, as many of the presentations that try to convince people of this idea seem to be confused on some pretty basic issues. First, don't buy Koestler's theory. One example is a scholar named Bernard Lewis. He's a man who the Encyclopedia of Historians and Historical Writing calls the, quote, most influential post-war historian of Islam and the Middle East. He's also a person with a long history of defending the religion of Islam. He said this about Koestler's book, The 13th Tribe, quote, this theory is supported by no evidence whatsoever. It has long since been abandoned by all the serious scholars in the field, including those in Arab countries, where the Khazar theory is little used except in occasional political polemics. Another man